Thank you very much for coming. This is a hybrid meeting. We have a number of people in person, and it's really so nice to see people coming together. We were just talking actually that a year ago, things were in a different situation, but we're very pleased to have people here in physical. But of course, because it's a hybrid meeting, we have the advantage of having people joining us from far away. We anticipate having some colleagues from New York and possibly other duty stations, and we're very pleased that one of our speakers is able to join us from Paris. So welcome and thank you for joining us in celebrating International Mother Language Day 2023. There is interpretation available in English and French. And very much thank you to our interpreter colleagues for supporting this meeting and making it more linguistically accessible. My name is Kira Kruglikova. I'm the director of the Division of Conference Management at the United Nations Office at Geneva. I am also UNOG's focal point for multilingualism. We at the UN have been observing International Mother Language Day every year for more than 20 years to celebrate the diversity of languages around the world and recognize the importance of multilingualism for the preservation of cultural heritage, promotion of social unity, and advancement of education. The UN General Assembly has recognized multilingualism as a core value of the organization, and our Secretary General Antonio Guterres has included multilingualism among his priorities. This year's theme is multilingual education, a necessity to transform education in a multilingual world. This theme highlights the critical role of mother languages in education and the challenges faced by minority language communities. At today's event, we are delighted to have with us renowned experts in multilingual education who will share their knowledge and experience. We have Mrs. Maki Katsuno Hayashikawa, the Director of the Division of Education 2030 at UNESCO. She'll be joining us remotely. We have Monsieur François Green, the Faculty of Translation and Interpreting of the University of Geneva, where he heads the Observatoire Économie Langue Formation, the Observatory on Economy, Languages and Training. We have Mr. Alberto Vilches, Spanish language teacher at UNOG's Center for Learning and Multilingualism. And I'm just going to take a quick sidebar and say I've actually been a client of the center, and I'm very grateful for the work and the support I've gotten both in working on my Russian and my French. So welcome. We also have Miss Isla Gordon, who is the early years principal of Campus de Nation at the International School of Geneva. And we have Mrs. Yvonne Crisfield, who is a specialist in multilingual education and a lecturer at Oxford Brookes University. So we will hear our experts' presentations, after which all of you will have an opportunity to ask questions. We will be giving priority to people who are physically present in the room, but of course our moderators will be taking questions online on Zoom. Please make sure you pose them in the Q&A section online. If you have any difficulty with the online, you can, there's usually a technical chat and our colleagues will help with that. We are recording this event and it will be made available later on our website, ungeneva.org. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Mrs. Maki Katsuno Hayashikawa is the Director of the Division for Education 2030 at UNESCO headquarters. She has over 25 years of experience with UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Japan International Cooperation Agency, managing global, regional, and country-level programs on inclusive education, gender and education, early childhood care and education, learning assessment, teacher education, and coordinating partnerships in education. As Division Director, Maki is responsible for overseeing UNESCO's global programs on gender and inclusive education, higher education, education in emergencies, and she leads the global SDG 4 coordination mechanism. And SDG 4, for those who don't have them all memorized, is quality education. So now if I can pass the floor to you, Mari, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. So, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, happy International Mother Language Day 2023. I wish to thank the Division of Conference Management at the United Nations Office in Geneva for organizing this event and inviting UNESCO to join you. Today, the day we celebrate the rich culture of languages, but let me start with a striking figure. Today, 4 in 10 people across the world do not have access to an education in a language they speak or understand. When we speak about the learning crisis, about learning poverty, there is no way we can ignore this reality. Unless we pay more attention to the role of languages from the earliest years of education throughout adult learning, we will not be able to meet our obligation to ensure meaningful, quality, and relevant learning experiences for all. For more than 7 decades, UNESCO has promoted language-based multilingual approaches as a central tenet of quality and inclusive education. UNESCO launched the International Mother Language Day we celebrate today in 1999 to precisely promote multilingualism and cultural and linguistic diversity. The celebration of the International Day has become an important event to advocate for and support multilingual education based on mother tongue, which UNESCO defines as the use of at least 3 languages in the classroom: the mother tongue, a regional national language, and an international language. The 2023 edition of International Mother Language Day and the theme of today's conference is addressing persisting challenges in the implementation of mother tongue-based multilingual education. The challenges are still enormous. As I shared earlier, 40% of the world's students do not have access to education in the language they speak or understand best. We have 771 million people around the world, 2/3 of them being women, still lack basic reading and writing skills. At least 40% of the more than 6,700 languages spoken around the world are threatened with extinction in the long term due to lack of speakers. This could have severe consequences for cultural diversity and jeopardize the centuries-old knowledge and know-how that may be decisive in humanity's efforts to solve the challenges of this century, including climate change and biodiversity losses. Furthermore, less than 2% of languages have any real presence online, including localized software and websites, translation and text-to-speech services, and content moderation algorithms. This prevents millions of indigenous language speakers and signers from fully engaging in society and shows a need for the active development of a truly multilingual digital world. At the United Nations Transforming Education Summit held last year, countries around the world made commitments to take bold actions to transform education in a rapidly changing world. 133 countries submitted their national statements of commitment, which were delivered by their head of state or government at the UN General Assembly Hall. An analysis of these 133 statements by UNESCO after the summit revealed that while 3 in 4 countries reported that addressing education exclusion was a national priority, less than 15% of those countries addressed inclusion from the perspective of cultural and linguistic minorities. And what is more shocking is that none of these countries addressed the issue of mother tongue instruction. At the same time, it was widely recognized during the broad multi-stakeholder consultations in the preparation of the summit and during the summit thematic sessions that in order to transform education, multilingualism must be systematically applied, while multilingualism can also advance inclusion and equity in education, leading to the transformation of education. It must work both ways. We need to transform education by creating an enabling environment for multilingualism through developing and or strengthening legislative frameworks and policies for inclusion, education, and society that take diversity and the multiplicity of needs into account, respecting and valuing such diversity, and eliminate all forms of discrimination. Through transforming education data systems to ensure that data are disaggregated by language, ethnicity, and other characteristics, this will allow us to understand more clearly the factors that lead to inequity, exclusion, and inequality, and so that we can use these data to allocate resources, especially for the most marginalized and disadvantaged. And through reforming the curricula and textbooks to be inclusive of all groups and avoid discrimination, including the availability in indigenous and local languages and in multiple accessible formats. Such efforts must be accompanied by the review of teacher training curriculum. Teachers will have to be trained and supported to deliver inclusive education. And of course, through starting early, building the foundation for learning with the learner's mother tongue, and gradually introducing the language of instruction in formal education to facilitate a smooth transition and development of children's social, emotional, and cognitive skills. Now, for all these, technology can help address the challenges. The digital revolution could be one of the most powerful tools for ensuring quality education for all. It can help transforming the way teachers teach and learners learn by unlocking the 3 keys of digital learning: connectivity in terms of infrastructure to reach the unreached, capacity to enhance systems, and of course, the capacity development of teachers, and content to be made available in the diversity of languages. But more specifically, solutions to implement multilingual education and safeguard languages with technology could include the identification and documenting of the status of the world languages, especially endangered languages, as UNESCO already does with the World Atlas on Language in Danger. The provision of tools, platforms, community resources, and skills development that empower communities that are otherwise left behind to create their own educational content in their own languages, responding to more culturally responsive and linguistically inclusive education. And by conducting and disseminating more action and research and scaling up evidence-based advocacy on the use of technology and language preservation, we still need to better understand what works and what doesn't, both in terms of technology used and contents delivered. The commemoration of the International Mother Language Day is certainly a key moment to seize to mobilize the global community and stakeholders to learn and exchange innovative experiences and practices. Now, with only 7 years left before the deadline of Education 2030, and as we start accelerating the follow-up actions to the Transforming Education Summit, we can no longer be doing business as usual. If we were to fulfill our commitment to leave no one behind and obligations to ensure the right to quality, inclusive, and equitable education throughout life for all, mother tongue-based multilingual education must become the norm of our business unusual. Cultural and linguistic diversity is a precondition for sustainable development of our world and at the heart of our educational agenda. UNESCO stands with you and our other partners to realize a world where every learner thrives and blooms as they learn in their mother tongue and in a multilingual education environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mari. Are we there? Yep. Thank you very much, Mari. Much appreciated. Okay. Our next speaker is Monsieur François Green. He is a renowned professor of language economics and education economics. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Geneva and has taught at various universities in Canada, the US, and Switzerland. He is currently a full professor at the University of Geneva's Faculty of Translation and Interpreting, where he also heads the Observatory on Economy, Languages, and Training. With over 200 publications, he has specialized in the evaluation of public policies related to language and education issues. Monsieur Green, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this invitation. We don't have a lot of time for something which can take us quite far, so let me jump straight into 3 questions. And I hope that this pointer is working. Doesn't seem to be. Oh, down. All right, got it. Thank you very much. So talking about MT, mother tongue, /L1, first language, but you can also call this mother language, main language, etc., home language at times. It's a very broad question. This raises 3 sub-questions. What exactly are we talking about? Why? What are the reasons for engaging, for offering a mother tongue L1 education? And then how do we do it if we agree it's a good idea? So I've highlighted in red the second question because that's what I'll be focusing on. But before doing so, may be useful to stop for a second and to ponder the fact that MTL1 medium education or instruction is something that can mean lots of very different things. Do we mean teaching it just as a subject, also as a medium of instruction? Do we mean that some or all subjects are taught in the curriculum, are taught through it? Do we mean that examinations and certification also take place in the language? Is it used throughout the curriculum, throughout all the grades and streams, or only for certain selected bits of the curriculum? And then what are all the associated expectations regarding teacher training, their language skills, the availability and use of various teaching materials, etc.? Then, of course, also the running of the school, contacts between school and parents, etc. It can mean lots of different things. There's lots of variability around all those dimensions, which is why we should think of MTL1 instruction pretty much as a continuum. I mean, I'd love to represent a multi-dimensional continuum, but beyond 3 dimensions, it's difficult to put visually. So let's just say that we have got one dimension, but that subsumes all the various things that I've listed and possibly even more. And so the idea is finding a proper place on this continuum. So there are 3. Let me now move to the question why, because there are essentially 3 types of arguments, and probably the best known ones are the rights-based arguments. And there is a substantial literature in distinct fields of research, the field of language and minority rights, a mostly legal approach. There is also another stream called linguistic human rights, which is astride various disciplines. And the main idea there is that fundamentally people, children in particular, have a right to MTL1 instruction. And it's an argument that I find simultaneously very strong and also paradoxically very weak. It's very strong because it appeals to value. It's very weak because it appeals to values, right? The problem is that not everybody agrees on those values, or maybe they can say that they agree with them, but in fact they don't. So the risk of resorting to rights-based arguments, and I suppose many of us have been confronted with that reality, is that either we find ourselves preaching to deaf ears, people who don't want to listen, who can't be convinced, who are fundamentally against the whole notion, and then people who are in favor, but then we're preaching to the converted. So what can we do? Then there is a second category of arguments, and I'm not going to spend much time on those because lots of people here are far more knowledgeable about it than I am. But there is a vast area of research which combines mainly psycholinguistics and the education sciences, which shows, and I think the results are in. It's pretty clear that children learn better, they develop more solid skills if they receive instruction, in particular if they can develop literacy in a language that they also speak at home with family and community. And this is what the first speaker, Mrs. Katsuno Ashikawa, was, I think, essentially referring to. Now, of course, bilingualism and even multilingualism are very valuable assets for everyone to have, but to fully benefit from bilingualism, I think it's important to also have a firm anchoring in mother tongue or L1. And this is one thing that it's important not to be waylaid in arguments, not among us, of course, but when speaking to the media or politicians. I think it's important to underline the fact that arguing in favor of mother tongue L1 education does not quite the contrary amount to arguing against multilingualism. So in what follows, the whole notion of introducing MTL1 education where it's not available is something that can be seen as part of a bilingual education system. I think we all agree on this, but sometimes, depending on who we talk to, it's really important to remind our audience, or possibly people who are on the other side of the fence, remind them of those facts. Now, the third argument, and the one that I wanted to devote the rest of this short presentation to, is an economic argument, which is rooted in education economics. Now, it offers an analytical framework, which is useful for integrating several empirical findings that I think relevant to our questions here. First thing is that using mother tongue L1 education, instead of using some language of wider communication, which is not the kid's home language, usually results in 3 positive outcomes. One is higher test scores. Second is less repetition of grades. And third is less dropping out of the education system. Now, of course, this usually is not entirely free. It entails some costs. But what's interesting there is that several, not all that many, but the few independent studies that I'm aware of on this all converge around a fairly similar figure of an extra cost of around 4 to 5% at most of an education system when you bilingualize the education system. And the reason is very simple. You have to school kids anyway. You're going to have to pay for teachers anyway. You're going to need school premises anyway. So the extra cost, the cost of changing over from a unilingual to a bilingual system, is usually far more modest than many people would automatically assume. Now, on this basis, we can go a little further and try and build a model using stylized facts to derive some of the policy orientations that come from that. So let's reason with an initial cycle of 5 years of elementary education And then we can assume that there is a certain cost per student and per year. Let's say 1,000. We've got some figures from Indonesia which point in that direction. But no matter what figure we take, for the sake of the example, doesn't matter. Let's just assume there is a basic baseline cost. And then what happens when we switch to a mother tongue medium education? There is this estimated increase of 4 to 5% in expenditure. But in order to be on the safe side and not to be accused of painting too rosy a picture, we can say that, well, let's increase it to 7.5%. In particular, because some languages need to be properly equipped. Not all languages are equipped necessarily in terms of stabilizing a norm, having a stabilized and generally agreed on grammatical norm, for example. So this may cost a bit extra, but okay, let's say 7.5% extra cost. But then how much does society stand to gain from making that switch? And that's where we can use some stylized facts. Essentially, these are from the very few studies about this. There is Guatemala, there is one in Cameroon, we used one on the Basque Country as well. So, so several very different situations. But what we can observe is that if you have teaching in a language of wider communication that the kids do not use at home, you typically have a certain, fairly important repetition rate, which can be in the region of 40%. And there is also typically 15% of the kids in a cohort that do not complete the education, the basic education cycle. So now, what do we do with this? Well, we can play around with those figures a little bit. And all right, without going into detail, essentially, if you have a 40% repetition rate in a 5-year program, it is as if you had a 7-year program that everybody completes. It's just a matter of, transforming the figures in the easiest possible way. And then we can also assume that the 15% dropout rate is spread over certain years in the 5-year cycle. And this generates the following chart. So the number of students that enter the system, assume a cohort of 100. If it were 100,000, make no difference, right? But assume 100, and that suppose that grade 2 is repeated by everybody, grade 4 is repeated by everybody. So you get a 7 years in total, and 7 years in total amount to the 40% increase I was just referring to, right? So this means a certain cost. And if you take into account the fact that some kids drop out of the system, then you have a bit less total cost at the end on average, which means that the total system cost in this case is 655,000 with the figures that we are using for this example. Now, what happens if we move to MTL1 education? The dropout rate goes down by about 1/3, and the repetition rate drops by about half. Which is why in the second table, 4R, the repetition, we assume that it is in the 4th grade that repetition no longer occurs. So we move from a 5-year, from officially 5, actually 7 to actually 6-year average cycle with a lower proportion of kids dropping out. And then we can simply put in the figures that we have hypothesized so far on the basis of what we have in existing empirical studies. And this is where you get the cost comparison. You get a cost profile of the system, just detailed, average per student for a cohort of 100 of 6,550 to complete the whole cycle. And if you do offer the same thing through mother tongue or L1, the cost profile drops to 6,289 or 290, depending on how you round it off, right? So the interesting thing is that with pretty basic assumptions, the total cost drops, generating a net savings, even if you take into account the extra cost of operating bilingually, of developing specific teacher training, specific teaching materials, you get a net savings of almost 4% in the system. So ultimately, the net cost of using mother tongue education may be lower than the net cost of sticking to the old ways of using only a language of wider communication. Now, All kinds of additional effects are not taken into account here. If they were, they would probably lend further support to this conclusion, in particular because better trained young people who actually understand what they're being taught, that helps. They usually will tend to have more successful careers. There is one study which also from Latin America that, again, on the basis of circumstantial evidence, and with the figures of 25 years ago, suggests an increase in yearly earnings, net yearly earnings in the region of $1,000 at purchasing power parity. And now this also increases GDP. Ultimately, it also reflects favorably impacts favorably on tax revenue. So let me insist in closing that these are rough estimates. Their only point is to establish plausibility. It goes in this encouraging direction, but of course, calculating actual values would depend on the availability of suitable data, of which there is precious little. So if you have ways of suggesting access to, actually can provide access to solid, detailed data, I'm taking, right? So thank you very much. Here are some references, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Grin. That was very interesting. And I have some questions, but after. Our next speaker will be sharing his vision of multilingual education here at UN Geneva. We have with us Mr. Alberto Vilches, Spanish teacher at the Center for Learning and Multilingualism at UN Geneva. He holds a PhD in language sciences from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona in Spain. In addition, he holds a degree in computer science from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, a degree in linguistics from the Universidad Pompeu Fabra, and a master's degree in applied linguistics from the Universidad Antonia de Nebrija. He has worked as a teacher of Spanish as a foreign language at universities and language centers in Spain, Russia, Germany, and the US. Mr. Vilches, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Kurikova. Well, I'm going to start with this brief presentation about the CLM, where I work as a Spanish teacher, and some implications we can talk about, or we can discuss from a multilingual group of learners that we do have at the UN. So first of all, talking about the CLM, the Center for Learning and Multilingualism, just to let you know that we are teaching the 6 official languages of the UN: Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, Spanish. We offer regular and special courses on a quarterly basis, and we're happy to announce that today is our 6th anniversary from the creation of the CLM. So happy birthday to us. We have a diverse group of learners. Our learners group is very wide. So we've from staff members to permanent mission, spouses, interns, consultants, among others. And in addition, we welcome students from more than 100 nationalities and nearly 70 mother tongues, which creates a multilingual community of learners, as you can see. Finally, we emphasize that in our learning center, inclusiveness and humility, 2 of the core values of our organization, stands out as our teaching and learning environment has a high degree of sensitivity to all cross-cultural differences, and especially values the knowledge, skills, and experiences of others in the context of second language learning. This will be discussed in the following presentation. Recently, I don't know if you've heard about it, but we adapted a framework for languages that establishes learning levels for each of the 6 languages in relation to different competencies that serve as a reference for assessment and learning in our unique teaching context. This gives us consistency and validity for our languages and recognizes teaching in the personal, public, and professional domain. The different skills we consider under language competence are made up of pragmatic competence, linguistic competence, and sociocultural competence. And I'm going to talk now about these different competence, but we're going to discuss a little bit how this has an impact on our multilingual community. So to understand our pedagogical approach and the inclusion of different competencies in teaching, we will begin by reviewing the inclusion of culture in our area of expertise. Culture within applied linguistics is understood as the constraints imposed on individual language users by the forces of tradition, convention, fashion, and ideology. In the 70s, we can see how language is present as a set of signs completely detached from any cultural component. Later, between the 70s and the 90s, both discourse analysis and pragmatics focus on communicative exchanges between speakers, taking into account not just a closed system of signs, but the cultural background of the speaker in his or her communication. Finally, from the 2000 to the present, language is considered as a symbolic practice that constructs the genres, identities, and subjectivities of our daily lives. We can see how, therefore, the inclusion of culture in the concept of language is changing from the word to the discourse or to the text as a key unit of communication. So to see a little bit about the rise of diverse communities, we have to say that today, on today's world, where globalization, technologization, and large-scale migrations build communities with greater linguistic, social, and cultural diversity, second language learning needs a renewal in its teaching pedagogies to account for contemporary conditions in which multilingualism is ever present in our teaching context. The first step is, therefore, to define the concept of language as a set of levels of social activity that cannot appear in isolation, but always together. The first level we're going to talk about is the micro level of social activity, where language users, with the help of their cognitive mechanisms and emotional capacities, interact with others in certain contexts, many of them, of course, multilingual. The second one is the one that considers institutions and communities in which the speaker projects his or her social identity. And the third is the one that takes into account ideological structures in a global dimension. In order to better understand the development of language learning in multilingual environments, this view is interesting in order to establish the areas in which multilingual phenomena intervene in the speaker. I think I'm going really fast, but then we have more time for discussion. Finally, these considerations lead us to formulate some crucial implications for second language teaching. The first one is that this new conception of language and social activity entails a new understanding of language teaching. It is necessary to expand learning opportunities in multilingual communities in order to transform communicative resources according to learners' needs, beyond purely linguistic constructions and visions that do not consider multilingual communities at all. The second one is that learning is situated. In line with the first implication, it is necessary to project the context from which the learner starts in order to confront and transform it with the reality of the target language in order to offer a productive and enriched vision of communication. Finally, from a sociocultural view of learning, second language teaching must be understood as mediated. The teacher and the element with which we interact in the classroom, like texts and types of activities, are responsible for guided learning, and therefore it's necessary to encourage activities awareness in the classroom through reflection and even activities for conceptual transformation. The learner's implicit knowledge must be revealed in class in order to guide their development. As an example of the above implications, and to conclude, we can comment that the projects we work with, we work with in the Spanish and other departments at the CLM have a series of steps in which we offer a space for initial reflection so that students can contribute to communicate to the communicative experience they have in their mother tongue in certain types of texts. In this type of activities, ideological and discursive elements emerge, which, coming from a multilingual context, provides a global vision of the different levels of activity that come into play in communication. Classroom work based on this discursive vision at all levels is the ideal environment for learning that respects and promotes multilingualism. And I'd like to finish with this quote from Michael Byram, and that says that it's of crucial importance for the maintenance and development of multicultural societies, the provision of education strategies that raise awareness of the issues and foster intercultural dialogue and communication. thank you. And yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much. That's a lot of material, and I look forward to having a copy of the presentation. I think that was very interesting. And of course, I look at it both as a perspective of the focal point of multilingualism, as well as one of your language students. So it's good to see all what goes behind things. Now we turn to our next speakers. That's Ms. Illa Gordon and Ms. Ewan Crisfield. Ms. Gordon is the early years principal of Campus de Nation at the International School of Geneva. She holds degrees from the universities of Geneva, Surrey, Oxford, Brookes, and Durham, and is a certified professional coach. She has taught in primary and middle schools in the UK and spent several years as a homeroom teacher, assistant principal, and primary years program coordinator at the International School of Geneva. She has also worked as a junior school principal at the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa, Kenya, where she pioneered a new translanguaging approach to bilingual education. Ms. Gordon is also a member of the International Baccalaureate Educator Network. Ms. Crisfield is an expert in bilingualism and bilingual education with over 20 years of experience in applied linguistics. She holds a Bachelor's of Education in Teaching English as a Second Foreign Language and a Master of Arts in Applied Linguistics. She has a diverse background that includes research, teaching, and teacher training, and supporting bilingual families. She is a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University and an active member of several research organizations. She continues to do research in the field of bilingualism with a special interest in promoting language equality in schools and the integration of languages across the curriculum. Ladies, you have the floor.
So thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. As you were mentioning, I come from a school just up the road, so haven't had too far to travel. I'm going to be spending a bit of time talking about a project on multilingualism in the early years. And co-presenting with me, I must say, is Dr. Ewan Crisfield, who just received this within the past few weeks. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ewan, now for that.
Thank you. I can only do linguistics emergencies. So I'm going to start the presentation by saying it's very difficult to follow a group like this of experts because they've already mentioned most of my hard-hitting statistics. And so I'm going to do a kind of a brief summary that focuses on the work that we're doing at Ecolint and that we do with schools around the world, starting with what I think are three very, very key points in our discussion about multilingualism in schools. The first is, oh, I'm sorry, that's very small. The first is three things that we know from consistent research across the globe about the experiences of children in education and the impact of being educated in your own language. And these are from a wonderful UNESCO report called How Can I Learn? If you don't understand, how can you learn? So the first is we know that being educated in your own language improves your academic achievement. We know that literacy is more successful in a language you know, as has already been mentioned, but I would add also literacy is more joyful in a language that you already know, and we want children to be readers. And finally, and I think very importantly, identity, well-being, and engagement are also increased in being educated in a language you know. Both of these were highlighted by the first and second speakers, and I can't speak to the economic argument because that's far out of my field, but I can definitely speak to the well-being. So we're going to contextualize this now in moving away from the discussion of bilingual schools to multilingual. And I'm going to start with Article 30 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I think sets us up to understand how important a child's language is. I argue we could use a couple more in there, particularly about language of education, but it states quite clearly children have the right to their own language. And then to repeat the statistic that was highlighted by the first speaker, globally, over 40% of children do not access education in a language they understand. This statistic comes mainly from children educated within national and local systems. I would like to highlight, though, that it also includes children who are educated in international schools, where the medium of instruction is almost exclusively English, and they do not also access English education in their own language. And so the question that we're going to try and answer today with Isla is what can be done about this quite dire situation. And I would say I agree with the first two speakers immensely. Where a bilingual program is feasible, a mother tongue based language program, that is absolutely the right thing to do. But the reality is that many classrooms these days are multilingual. I have never had the good fortune of going into a school and saying a bilingual program will be easy because all of your kids speak the same language. So we're going to look at the question of how schools can meet the needs of many mother tongues within the same classroom, not just one, not just two, not a bilingual program, but actually a multilingual program. And we're going to situate this in the discussion of ethics in education and how important it is to make ethical decisions about the languages of and for the children in our classrooms. And so I'm going to hand over to Isla, who's going to talk about the project that has been running at Penny for 5 years.
Thanks very much, Erin. So indeed, it's a challenge, a really interesting challenge to ensure that as an educational institution, we have the responsibility to support the development of our children's home languages or mother tongue languages, otherwise known as, but equally a responsibility to ensure that they can access the content of what is happening in the classroom in the school's language of instruction. And in our case, that is English as the main language of instruction. So at Ekelund, we have over 4,500 students with 134 nationalities this year, and they bring to us more than 80 home languages. And you can see from the profiles of the example of 2 5-year-old students with us at our school, is that their language profiles are very complex, and often they join us without any knowledge of English. So as a school, we know that the research says that it's really important to be using the children's home language to develop the school's language of instruction. However, when we have such a multitude of numbers of home languages, the challenge remains how to do this. We often hear people saying, children just learn languages through osmosis. And the earlier you start, the better. And the research actually says that that is a myth. So what is really important to us is that we have a structured language acquisition and development program, which centers around the individual profile of the student, yet every student's profile is different. So what we do, what we've been doing with this project is we've been collecting the profile, the language profile of every single student in the school, and it's reviewed annually by the teachers. And based on that, the teachers then make decisions about which languages they use, depending upon the context and depending upon the learning objective for the students. We also think very carefully about the placement of students in our classes and about how we group them. And we look for other students and we look for other teachers who can communicate with them in their home language, or we ensure that teachers have access to resources to be able to support them with that. When you're in a situation learning in a language of instruction, which is not your home language, you're doing double the amount of work because you're learning the content, what's being explored in the classroom, but you're also having to learn all of the new vocabulary and the language structures in that language too. So for the emotional and social well-being of the children, it's really important that that they have points during the school day when they can actually speak in their home language, which allows them to decompress and also provides them with the psychological safety that they need in the school context. We reach out to we also reach out to families because in fact, what is really important in this kind of project is the importance of the parent-school relationship. So we reach out to the parents of the children, asking them ahead of a topic that's been covered in class to provide us with vocabulary, with sentence structures in the children's home languages. These then go into a vocabulary book, and English The English is entered into that, as well as French, often the French too. And this becomes a tool that is used by a student. And funny enough, it's a tool that is then also used by the classroom teacher as well, as that they will then often make the effort to learn the words and the sentence structures in the student's language. And you can get a lovely dynamic actually when you have our young learners teaching their teachers how to pronounce words and how to say things in their home language. And you could see a lot of pride, you know, in the children having that been honored in the classroom. Another part of the project is families language sessions that we offer, where we reach out to the families, those with particularly complex family profile, language profiles. And this this is for a number of different reasons. One thing that family language planning sessions does is it allows families to think carefully about which languages make sense for their children in terms of reasons for heritage, those for identity, also where the families are currently living and where they might be living in the future as well. These sessions also enforce the importance of home language for cognitive, identity, academic, and emotional development. They support a pluralistic outlook where all languages are valued and have the same status, and reinforce the importance of parents continuing to support the development of their children's home languages, as opposed to at home suddenly swapping to one of the languages of the school. And they also support parents' understanding and our approach to children's language acquisition and development. So as I mentioned, the project's been ongoing for the past 5 years. We're learning a lot. We still have a lot to learn in this area. One thing that we know is it's so important to be working close with experts and with the research, hence our collaboration with UN. So much of what we think, you know, about how we acquire languages and things we hear is actually counterintuitive to what the research says. And I think another breakthrough that we've had in terms of our learning is that it is absolutely possible, providing the teachers have enough professional development and that they hone their skills and their confidence in welcoming the students' languages into the classroom. It's actually possible for children to be learning in their classrooms without our teachers speaking all 80 of Ekelant's languages. So I'm about to hand back to Eowyn, and just whilst I do, I just want to mention I have Nikki and Tanya who are here with me, been highly involved, 2 colleagues who have been highly involved in the project. So when we have the panel discussion later on, I would really appreciate if they could join in the conversation as well. Yeah.
So I'm going to finish just by reminding us that I think we've been standing at an ethical crossroads in education for a very long time, looking at the signposts and saying, what do we do? We know the research is convincing that children need their own language in their education, and we're making small movements in the right direction. But I think if we move away from talking about strictly the structures that we put in place and the policies and think about the child in the classroom, we can move forward with a lot more agility than if we're trying always to make a difference in these, in classrooms from a top down. And so this is a quote from a chapter that Isla and I co-authored with another researcher, another partner, on actually the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa and their translanguaging approach to an English Kiswahili bilingual program, where we situated as an ethical bilingual education approach. And I think that that's what we need to be moving towards globally. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been a very rich exchange of, well, not exchange, a rich provision of information. And now we'll get into the discussion. But really, thank you so much. And I really appreciate how the different presentations interlock together. But as I mentioned, we'll start with questions in the room. And then after that, we'll take questions from the chat. So does anybody want to get us started? Please go ahead, sir, you have the floor.
Yes, I want to introduce myself. My name is Sufi Lagari, and I'm originally from the Sindh, which is the province of Pakistan. And Sindhi population is 55 million speaking, and it is not recognized in Pakistan as a national language. And Urdu is imposed on us And today you are celebrating the International Language Day because of Bangladesh is my friend sitting here. And that was the reason this language day is coming to celebrating. And this is the first program I'm attending in the United Nations. After 5 years, this program is happening. My question is, when people like us facing this kind of the challenging, more than 10,000 schools are closed, our languages. People are not aware about it. I'm sure many people here are not aware about it. Would you recommend anything that what can we do for that kind of the problem? Thank you.
All I can say is I wish I had an answer. I think that the contexts are very different in different parts of the world. It's highly political. I teach my graduate students all the time that language and politics are intermingled in ways that we cannot divorce. And I honor the martyrs of Bangladesh for bringing us this day. And I think it goes to show how deeply emotive the issue of language and education is, that students are willing to engage like that. And I don't have an answer for you, except for we need to keep talking about it. And we need to go into the schools and talk about it as well. Because I think I see in the work that I do, I see amazing things happening in classrooms. One of the best examples of multilingual pedagogy I saw in a video from rural India. No technology, blackboards only, and the teacher was doing a wonderful job of weaving in the languages of the children in her class with the language they're meant to be learning. And it can happen just like that if we let it, but it's whether or not it's permitted on a political level.
Thank you very much for that. And I appreciate, sir, that you've taken the time to raise that, because it's a reminder to all of us that these are not academic issues. These are issues that impact millions of people around the world. Do we have another question from within the room? Please. Nigel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm Nigel Lindop, a translator here at the UN, English translator. Very interested to hear about the project at Ecolint. My own children went to the local school system, but I guess that the context of the Geneva system is very similar linguistically to Ecolint. You have 134 languages and 80 134 nationalities and 80 languages. It's probably similar in Geneva. Ecolint probably has quite a lot more resources to dedicate to this kind of project. I wonder how one can help state systems to develop in the same kind of way, given the usually cash-strapped situation that they find themselves in when you think about training teachers for receiving other languages and so on, very specialist training. I wonder if you have any experience of working with state systems. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nigel. Do we have any volunteers? Voluntold.
Very opposite question, that on the basis of essentially circumstantial evidence that we have, there are lots of signs that suggest that not only is the extra cost of multilingualizing a system more modest than people generally assume, but also, and then also, I was mentioning the Basque Country because part of the figures, the 4 to 5% extra spending is something that we arrive using, comparing the various education streams that have been put in place after 1975 in the Basque Country, which is, again, Western situation, developed country, which, and I realize, and as Eowyn was saying, every case is different, every case is special. But interestingly, some colleagues from the World Bank, because this study that I was mentioning was first produced for the World Bank, looking at a bilingual Spanish Maya program in Guatemala, end up with similar, 4 to 5% extra cost range. So it's probably not that expensive. Now, if you're factoring all the advantages that this brings in, it makes it probably a little bit easier to convince authorities that no, it may be gainful for them as well, right? At the end of the day, that they're going to have a higher degree of cost effectiveness. And I know talking about cost effectiveness when we're talking about, the basic right of quality education for all, this may sound horribly brutal, but just saying again, we need to persuade people who are not already convinced. And I think those figures can help.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And of course, we all know in this time of budget crunch that, well, it's always, it's the eternal budget crunch. Nobody ever says we have lots of resources, let's spend it. But it is quite interesting because, I was struck in your presentation that when you look at the longer term, and it's not that long, when you look in the perspective over a few years, you can see that this is economically beneficial. But the question is, of course, what is your policymaker and what is their financial horizon? So you see attention with that.
Always.
Do we have any other comments from the room? And then we'll switch to online. Do we have any online questions?
Yes.
We have online question. How do you ensure that multilingual speakers can participate globally while encouraging the use of mother languages?
So I think it's not about mother language only. It's about mother language plus. And so we focus on the development of their own language in the early years of education and the acquisition of a language of wider use. And that language should be, again, not always English. It should be the one that is the right fit. So for example, for the school in Mombasa, the language of wider use is Kiswahili. Many of those children also speak other local languages, but that's the language that will get you the farthest in that area of Africa. In the Philippines, that language of wider use would be Tagalog. It doesn't have to be English. We default to English when we should be doing child's language, local important language, and then English. And so I would say that we're not saying they should only have their mother tongue. They should start with that and use it as the building blocks of many other languages throughout their education.
Then I can say that I fully support, wholeheartedly agree with Eowyn. So we're really not talking about not either this or that, but we're talking about this and that.
And if I could just add a couple thoughts on this. I mean, we've seen with COVID what a shift there has been in the technology of online. So for instance, this meeting, if you're watching on Zoom, if you wish, you can go ahead and get captions. This is captioning is speech to text technology. We also have, on the other hand, we have machine translation that's out there. You already can, in certain programs, get captions in a different language than the person is speaking. Now, is it excellent? Is it best? Is it anywhere near the quality that you would need if you were negotiating a text? No, it's not. But this may be a question that's not exactly moot, but it will be a different question, in my opinion, in maybe 10, 15 years, because there will be technical intermediaries that will allow people to, the whole Tower of Babel thing. People can use their mother tongue. I'm very fortunate. I'm a native English speaker, so I'm fortunate that I can speak English at the UN, but I have so much admiration for colleagues who are working in a different language than theirs. It's a little bit like wearing shoes that don't quite fit, But we see the technology moving so fast that this question about whether or not speakers, how you can have multilingualism in a panel, in 15 years, it may almost be a moot question, in my opinion. I know there's a lot of difference on that and a lot of thoughts on the technology, but it's a good question, and I think we will watch to see the evolution on that. Do you have another question?
No, I think this is it.
What?
Yeah, I mean, we have more than one comment, but it's more than comment than a question, and I think it's been answered before. It's about the education for children in Palestine, but you did mention that multilingual education and politics are very interlinked sometimes. So,
all the time. Well, and not only language in education, just language in general, because it's such a cultural marker, is of course something that has such an impact on people. Well, let me, Lynn, if I could conclude with some very warm thanks to our speakers, as well to Mari, who's online, and how much we appreciate you taking the time to bring your perspectives to us here. Again, as I mentioned, this is going to be recorded, so please feel free to share it widely. And again, if you have ideas or things that you're interested in, please also share that with us. We do these celebrations every year. We try to bring a new perspective and a new approach. So there will always be next year, but this is an evergreen topic and it's very, very important. And we appreciate those of you who came in person and those of you online joining us. So I think I'll conclude, but thank you very much, everyone.